All right, guys, on this episode of Andrew Bernard Outdoors, we're going to be breaking down my arrow setup. And this is something I've gotten a bunch of requests for since I switched to my 80-pound setup. And today I needed to fletch a few arrows, so I figured this would be the perfect time to shoot a little video. So without further ado, stay tuned, and I hope you guys enjoy. Okay, so before we get too involved in fletching these arrows, I'm going to break down my setup. For the viewers that don't know, this is an 80-pound Hoyt Carbon RX-4 Ultra. I have a Cam 2 with the mods turned out to a 30-inch draw length. So my draw length's pretty long. Now, with that being said, the things that decide the arrows that you shoot, there's two primary things, and that is draw length and draw weight. Now, your spinage is going to be how thick that carbon wall is on the arrow, and that is super important because if you're not shooting a heavy enough spine, you're basically resembling a dry fire when shooting a bow if you're using too light of an arrow. Now, a big thing that I'm seeing nowadays, and I get this from all kinds of archery shops, when I was working in an archery shop and the newer archery shops that I talk to and I'm friends with, they see a lot where these guys are so worried about shooting a heavier arrow, heavier arrow. And I do agree that your arrow needs to be a little bit heavier than what you really need. It doesn't hurt it and actually can help quiet your bow, and it's also going to help with the penetration factor. But there are some guys that go overkill on it and shoot way too heavy, and that's actually hurting your feet per second. That's actually hurting the performance of your bow, and you don't need all that. But for me, being a 30-inch draw and having an 80-pound limb setup, I need the absolute heaviest arrow out there because it's basically the highest amount of weight that you can purchase on a bow. I think they have 85-pound mods now. I know Cameron Haynes shoots like a 90-pound setup, but that's not something that you can custom order. That's a private thing made specifically for him. And truthfully, you don't need to go over 70. I don't care what anyone says. The next setup that I want to get is going to go back to aluminum, and I'm going to get 70-pound limbs. It's going to be my whitetail setup. The bow that I built that I'm currently shooting, I bought and built for the purpose of going out west and hunting out west, larger game. You don't need 80, 90-pound limbs to hunt whitetails across the Midwest or in the eastern portion of the U.S. There's just no reason for it. It's overkill. And this past season, it was a testament to that. The buck that I killed in Ohio, I actually broke the arrow because of how hard the arrow went through the deer and impacted the ground. It wasn't the deer, the shoulder blade or the ribs that busted up the arrow. It was the impact of the roots from the tree behind it. When it impacted that, it just basically cracked the arrow down the shaft because it was overkill. You don't need it. But like I said, I built that setup for my trips that I have planned out west in the future. And like I said, down the road, I would like to build another whitetail setup because you do not need to shoot that crazy of a poundage for just shooting whitetails, in my opinion. But when it comes to going out west, you're hunting larger game and you're pushing the distance, it can't hurt to go up if you can draw it. And I'm going to continue to hunt with this for this next year because I don't want to buy another bow, but you don't need it. But going back into the arrows, the arrow that I'm currently shooting for that setup and we're going to work on today is the Easton Access 5mm arrow, and I have the match grade series. Now, the difference between the regular Access and the match grade Access is the straightness in the arrow. Do you need to go to the match grade? No. I do, however, because of the setup that I was trying to build with the distance, because I shoot out to 100 yards with it, I get groups like no other, and that straightness will help with that a little bit with your groups out at like 80, 90, 100 yards. You see spinage across the board broken down differently for basically every brand. Carbon Express does like a 250 and a 350. You go into Easton, they're like a 260, a 340, a 400. I mean, their charts are broken down differently, and the easiest way to look at that is going on the back of a box of your arrows or talking to an archery professional that's behind the counter, and he can help you get figured out, because it doesn't just go into the weight of your bow, it also goes into the total length of your arrow. And a lot of people get that confused. They think that their draw length and draw weight is what's going to decipher that arrow. But when you select your draw length, you're actually looking at what that arrow is going to draw out at on your bow, where you're cutting that arrow off. I like my arrows to be cut off right at the edge of my riser. And with this, even though my draw length is set at 30 inches on my Ultra, my arrow length is actually 29.5 carbon to carbon. So I'm about 29 3/4 when you include that knock, but my broadheads hang out off the edge of my riser, which is a safe thing to do. You don't necessarily have to do that. I see a lot of guys cut their arrows in. I don't understand why, because if something were to ever go wrong with that broadhead, that arrow, your rest fall, and that arrow hit your riser, hit your finger, something like that, it's a dangerous game to play. And that half an inch or 2 inches out onto your riser, right at the edge of your riser, it's not hurting anything, and it's honestly, like I said, it's just a safer way, and I like doing it that way. But again, arrow length is 29 1/2, and then with that knock, you're getting maybe be 29 3/4. Going into the spinage of what you can select for like an 80-pound bow. Other arrows that you can look at are like the FMJ series, which is the full metal jackets. One thing you see with shooting a heavier pound bow is your arrows get messed up very easily. Basically anything and everything affects that arrow because of the force that goes into it. And like I said, I lost an arrow this past fall when I shot that buck in Ohio because of how hard it drove through that deer and impacted the ground. And what you will get out of the full metal jackets is it's an aluminum it's a metal alloy that runs around the arrow, and you got that carbon interior. But those arrows bend, and you cannot bend them back. It's not something, once an arrow is bent, that's why they did away with aluminum arrows. Once they're bent, they're shot, you got to pitch them. So it's an expensive arrow to shoot and then have them get dented and dinged up. And a lot of the people that actually shoot heavier poundage bows, 80, 90-pound bows, don't shoot aluminum arrows. They're going to those carbon arrows. Carbon is a lot more durable. It flexes, it goes with the shot, and they don't break as easy. And in my opinion, I think, in all seriousness, I think with the straightness of it, your carbon's going to hold that straightness a lot better than that metal, because you might not think your arrow's dent, but if you roll that arrow on the flat table, it might move a little bit. And like I said, that FMJ, I'm just not a big fan of it. But that is another option you can look at when it comes to your heavier pound setups, because you are looking for your heavier grains per inch. I was for a minute there trying out the Maxima Reds 350s by Carbon Express on my Hoyt Ultra, because that's what I had on my previous setup. But I was having so much trouble paper tuning with those arrows because the grains per inch on that were not heavy enough. And with these 260s, you're getting an 11.5 grains per inch, which is pretty huge, because those 350s, I think they're down at like a 9.3 or 9.5. And that little bit more helped out so much, and the bullet holes that I get right now are absolutely insane, and that's important to me. And like I said, the weight of that arrow also helps dampen that bow in the shot. And so when I was shooting those 350s by Carbon Express, there was a lot more sound coming from that bow, and as soon as I switched over to these arrows, I noticed a huge difference in the sound. I'm definitely very happy with these guys. Like I said, I shoot out to 100 yards now all the time with no problem, and that's a big reason why I ended up going to the match grade series too. Does it really matter that much? I think a little bit, but it's not something you have to really push into the match grade. You can get the regular accesses at a 260 spine if you're not really worried about the straightness, especially if you're not pushing out at the distance. But like I said, if you're building this 80-pound setup, it better be for something other than whitetails. That's all I have to say to that. I'm not a Cameron Hanes wannabe, and that's, I think, what a lot of these guys get into, is they think heavier poundage, heavier this, heavier that, it's going to kill these animals. Know the game you're hunting before you go into selecting the bow that you want to build, because you don't need 80 pounds, and I don't think the pros talk about that enough. And again, this is my arrow setup. I go with a 3-vein Blazer Fletch setup. I do straight Fletch. I don't do any helicals or anything like that. In my opinion, you can get a helical to get a little bit more spin, a little bit more accuracy out of it, but I don't really think that matters. I mean, maybe like mil spec, it might help it a little bit, but in all seriousness, I just don't think it's worth it. So going into everything that I have on this arrow, I'll go ahead and give you guys a total weight of what my arrow's at. Complete setup, like I said, we're looking at a 29.5 inch carbon to carbon Easton Axis 5mm 260 spine arrow, 11.5 grains per inch, and then I've got a nocturnal lighted knock. We'll go ahead and weigh that real quick. Probably should get my calculator out because I'm not going to remember all this. And when I practice, when I shoot everything exactly how I hunt. Because if you look at the arrow that I have here, I have one of the, and I have not killed anything with this yet, but I'm currently, and I'm going to try it out for turkey season, I have the Rage No Collar Extremes. I'm a huge Rage fan. I have been for the longest time. I probably won't ever switch broadheads unless I have to switch to a fixed if I'm out west. My broadhead itself, we're looking at 100.2 grains. So we got 100.2. We'll go with the knock. So this is the nocturnal universal knock, but with my setup, the arrow build, it actually doesn't need a collar insert, so it's just the knock, and that's at 23.6. And then at the front of that arrow, I also have a little collar. They're made by Easton. What this does is for your mechanical broadheads when you're shooting a hidden insert arrow, which HIT insert arrow, which you guys, for the FMJ users or for the Easton Access arrows, you're going to have an HIT insert which is pre-inserted down your arrow at a specific length. The process for doing that, it's pretty simple to do. You have a glue that you have to mix up once you get your arrows, and you have to let these arrows dry for 24 hours flat, not moving, so that the insert doesn't slide or move. But once they're in there, they're in there. I've had no issues with the inserts whatsoever. I was a little skeptical about that when I switched, but because of that, you're flush right here at carbon. There's nothing sticking out. There's no metal insert that can protect that carbon. So they make a collar for your mechanical broadheads. So if they expand and they accidentally catch that end of the arrow, it doesn't split your arrow right at the end. So that little collar, it's not much, but we're looking at 4.6 grains. So pretty close to a 5, but I'm going to do it right on the money. And like I said, I practice with what I shoot because that 5 grains can make a huge difference out at like 100 yards. And then with everything that I have on here, again, this is the HIT insert. This is just the regular one. It's not a heavier weighted insert that they make. And then I've got a 3-vein straight fletch, blazer fletch setup on the back end of this arrow. The total weight for that right now, I'm looking at 379.4 grains. All right, so total weight right now with everything on the arrow, put into the arrow, we're looking at 507.8 grains, which is pretty hefty because a lot of the most common setup, and if you go into an archery shop and you look at what you see on a lot of like retail stores, or you look at how they do the IBO ratings, it's shot at 29 inches at 70 pounds because that is the most common weight that's used and the most common draw length that's used. And a lot of those arrows are averaging out at like right over 400. So I'm almost 100 grains over what the average setup is. And again, this is a necessity for what I have because again, if you're shooting too light of an arrow on a setup like that at 80 pounds, it's resembling a dry fire and you're only hurting the bow when you shoot it. So again, when I'm practicing, I literally have all my practice arrows set up with a 100 grain field tip. I use those collars because that 5 grains, like I said, I think that can make a difference, especially when you take into account if you're shooting with this collar and shooting with lighted nocks, because these lighted nocks weigh more. So going into the difference on the weights of your nocks, like I said, the reason I practice with that is because if you look at the weight of one of the normal nocks that comes with it, you're looking at 8.6. You take into account that you're using that lighted nock, I'm looking at 23.6. So if you take that into account on the weight difference of the nock, I'm looking at almost 15 to 20 grains difference, including that collar and including that lighting nock, instead of just shooting it like this as a practice arrow. Because you don't need either one of these to practice, but that weight difference right there at 100 yards, 80 yards, 90 yards will make a huge difference. And that's not just for an 80-pound bow. I'm talking also if you were shooting, 70-pound setups, because I think even with your 70-pound setups, your 60-pound setups, that collar is a necessity. And like I said, if you're hunting with those lighted nocks, you're still looking at a pretty big weight difference. So all right, guys, the arrows are all fletched. They look great, and I cannot wait to get out and shoot because turkey season is right around the corner, and before you know it, deer season will be here again. But if you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button, and if you want to see more content like this, leave some video ideas down in the comments below. I love doing stuff like this. I love talking archery, and as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys later on the next episode of Andrew Bernard Outdoors.